I'm Evelyn Marsh, and the morning I walked onto my own vessel in San Diego, I expected a maintenance report, not my father lounging in my robe with a glass of my bourbon, as if he'd been crowned king of the harbor. He lifted the tumbler like a toast and murmured that I needed to move my things to the crew quarters because Colton required the master suite to recover, while my mother rubbed a scoop of my night cream into her heel without looking up and told me not to stand there acting difficult. I caught the edge of something folded beneath my father's glass, a note placed upside down with my name written in his handwriting, and knew before touching it that whatever they were here for wasn't an accident. Samuel met me at the gangway the moment I stepped back out into the air, his cap twisting between his palms as he whispered that they had shown IDs and claimed it was a surprise family visit, then begged me not to fire him because they had told him that was exactly what I'd do. The kid looked sick, and when he admitted, my father knew his probation dates and used them like leverage. The weight of their intrusion settled in the way a storm presses against steel before the first strike. I told him to take his break, that I'd deal with the mess they'd dragged on board, and his relief only sharpened the wrongness already spreading through the deck. Inside the salon, 4 suitcases blocked the walkway as if they were staking territory, and Colton, stretched across the leather sofa, announced that the place looked sterile but workable, then asked if the Wi-Fi was strong enough for him to stream without interruptions. My mother drifted in, wiping her hands on one of my towels, and mused that I shouldn't be dramatic because family doesn't need invitations, while my father rose just close enough for me to smell the bourbon he'd taken and reminded me that they had raised me, housed me, and sacrificed so I could have all of this. When he gestured around the cabin like it was the return on an investment he believed he owned, the note under his glass flashed in my mind again. The secret no one acknowledged, but all of them were waiting to drop, and I knew whatever they wanted hadn't even begun to surface. Richard planted himself in front of the bar the moment I stepped back into the salon and asked whether I planned on calling harbor police or if I finally understood that throwing my own parents off my vessel would make me look ungrateful in every way that mattered. And Linda brushed past him, commenting that Colton couldn't take another hit right now because the lender had already started sending photos of his car to scare him. Colton didn't bother sitting up as he mentioned the amount, $152,000, spoken like weather, and when I told them this was a commercial vessel and they were trespassing, Richard lifted his hands as if calming a child and floated the idea that family emergencies supersede maritime rules. The way he glanced at the suitcases hemming in the walkway made it clear they hadn't come for a conversation, but for a placement, one they intended to keep until I caved. Linda leaned against the counter, smoothing her blouse, and noted that I had plenty of cash flow to fix this, since my business never seemed to struggle the way theirs did. Then added that it was heartless to leave my brother exposed when all he needed was one clean break to reset his life. Colton muttered that he'd already given up his apartment that morning because they told him I'd step up once I heard the details. And when I asked why his choices were suddenly my liability, Richard tapped the edge of my coffee table and remarked that raising me had cost money too. The phrase retroactive repayment slid out of him with rehearsed ease as he explained that supporting me through school and housing should have been considered an investment. And the moment he framed my childhood as a debt accruing interest, the note under his glass crystallized in my mind with painful clarity. I told them liquidating that much operational capital in one day would jeopardize insurance reserves and fuel contracts. But Linda waved the concern off with a breezy assurance that businesses rebound while sons do not. Colton clicked his tongue and mentioned that the lender wasn't giving him a week, much less the month I claimed I'd need to restructure accounts. And Richard stepped closer to remind me that responsible daughters don't weigh profit margins against their brother's safety. The bourbon on his breath caught the light between us as he murmured that I had the means, the opportunity, and the moral obligation because family equity doesn't expire. And the satisfaction in his eyes told me he believed he'd cornered me in my own cabin. I asked why they hadn't sold their house if they were so committed to saving him. And Linda laughed softly before explaining that older parents can't simply uproot themselves when their daughter has more than enough. Colton added that my company existed because they had kept me afloat after graduation, a claim delivered with the confidence of someone who had never tallied a bill in his life. And Richard nodded solemnly with the assurance that he'd already run the numbers and found the total uncannily close to the $152,000 they needed. The room tightened around the suitcases. The bourbon, the towel still damp from my mother's hands, and as their version of math folded over my success like a net, I understood they hadn't come seeking help but collecting a return. I stepped out onto the upper deck for air that didn't taste like the bargain they were trying to pin on me, and the marina lights cut across the water in a way that made Richard's remark about retroactive repayment sit heavier than anything else he'd thrown at me. Colton's voice still echoed from the cabin, insisting that his deadline was tonight, and that I was the only one standing between him and whatever those photos implied. And the mix of entitlement and urgency clung to me like a film I couldn't wash off. The note Richard had left under his glass resurfaced in my thoughts because the handwriting was too careful for something casual. And the fact that none of them acknowledged it told me they were holding a bigger demand than the number they had said out loud. I walked down the gangway with the hum of generators behind me, replaying the way Linda dismissed the risk to my company as if a business could snap back the moment family snapped its fingers. And her certainty that I would choose them over every contract on my books revealed how long they had been planning this. The street beyond the pier felt cooler, but the pressure of knowing they'd already given up their house based on an outcome they believed they controlled pushed against my ribs with a steady pulse. When I glanced back at the rail and saw Samuel watching from the shadows with the same worried crease he'd worn when he admitted he'd been cornered by their IDs and threats, the pieces locked into place because they hadn't improvised any of this. The truth of it settled without ceremony. Fighting them inside that cabin would never shift the ground because Richard had already rewritten the terms of history to make my success a withdrawal account he could tap. Letting them argue their way deeper into my space would only feed the script they'd rehearsed. And every line they delivered made it clear they were too invested in the role they'd cast me in to recognize limits. The moment that realization landed cleanly, the next step came just as clean, because Phoenix was the only place I could walk into without them tracking the narrative or the leverage. I reached Phoenix before noon and stepped into Elaine's office with the demand letter folded in my hand. And her eyes moved straight to the creased paper as she asked what Richard had pushed onto my deck this time. So I told her the number and the deadline, and the way they'd already packed their bags as if the outcome were decided. She skimmed the letter once and murmured that Blake Henning never chased debt unless he planned to sell it. Then tapped the margin where Colton's signature sat crooked and remarked that this alone told her exactly how sloppy the original arrangement must have been. I laid the letter between us and added that they were framing this as family equity, and the way her brow lifted made the room settle into a different kind of clarity. Elaine reached for her tablet and sketched a line across a blank page while asking whether I wanted to rescue my brother or rescue myself. And I told her I intended to stop the storm before it landed on my books because Richard was too comfortable betting with other people's lives. She angled the tablet toward me and pointed to the option that would end it cleanly, noting that we could offer Blake a same-day cash purchase of the note at a discount because he preferred liquidity over theatrics. When I asked what would happen once the debt transferred, she replied that ownership grants control. And the way she phrased it felt as precise as any contract clause she had ever drafted. I opened my operating account summary on my phone and told her the range I could move without destabilizing payroll or fuel reserves. And she nodded before stating that Blake would accept a number far lower than the $152,000 Richard believed was required. She dialed him directly while adjusting the discount figure with a fingertip, and he accepted before the second pause stretched, agreeing to wire confirmation within the hour. When the call ended, she turned to a fresh document and began crafting a secured guarantee tailored to the scenario my family had created, framing it as an asset pledge that would trigger the moment they acknowledged insolvency. I watched her type their names into the guarantor lines, and she asked whether they would sign without reading, which made me recall how Richard bragged about running calculations on my childhood as if it were a ledger, and how Linda spoke of my company as though it were spare change. I told her they would sign anything if they believed it protected their narrative, and she adjusted a clause near the bottom to ensure default would lock instantly once the transfer settled. When she handed me the completed packet, the final page held the weight of something irreversible. and knowing they had already positioned themselves on my vessel as beneficiaries of my work. I recognized that all I needed to do was place this in front of them and let their confidence carry the rest. I returned to San Diego at dusk, with the packet Elaine prepared, tucked inside my tote. And when I stepped back onto the vessel, the salon lights were already on as if they'd been waiting for a verdict. So Richard asked whether I had handled the bank or if I'd wasted the day proving a point. Linda watched me with a look that blended impatience and triumph, while noting that Colton hadn't slept since morning and that any further delay would only make his situation worse. And Colton nudged his empty glass toward me, muttering that the lender's messages had doubled while I was gone. I let my shoulders drop as I told them the transfer was possible but complicated because moving that amount from a corporate account triggers audits that would freeze the funds if the bank detected anything resembling a gift. Richard leaned forward with sudden interest when I added that I needed documentation from them before the wire could clear. And he asked what sort of paperwork could possibly matter when the only thing that mattered was me fixing what he called a time-sensitive family crisis. I placed my phone on the table and angled it against a coaster, explaining that large transactions require internal compliance recordings to confirm no one is being coerced and that the bank expects verbal acknowledgement from all parties involved. Linda waved a hand at the camera and told me to get on with it because none of them had the energy for theatrics. And the way she settled back into the sofa made it clear she believed she was finally steering the moment. I opened the packet just enough for the corner of the signature page to show and asked them to confirm on record that the debt in question belonged to Colton and that none of them possessed liquid assets capable of covering it. And Richard nodded sharply as he stated the amount and insisted that their inability to pay was exactly why they needed me to step in. Colton added that if he had the money, we wouldn't be having this conversation. And Linda chimed in that it was ridiculous for auditors to question a sister saving her brother when everyone in the room knew he deserved a clean slate. Their voices carried the steady rhythm of a truth they believed was self-evident. And each line they spoke slid neatly into the structure Elaine had built into the guarantee. I placed the document on the table with a pen resting on top and told Richard that, to justify the tax classification, I needed a secured guarantee showing that the transaction was tied to an asset, then added that no one but the auditors would ever see it. Colton picked up the pen first and scrawled his name across the guarantor line without looking at the terms. And Linda followed with a flourish, as she remarked that this was what families did when one person carried the load. Richard took the pen last, muttering that this was long overdue, and the ink settled into the page with the quiet finality of something they believed protected them. I folded the papers back into the packet and told them the wire would process once the compliance file uploaded. And Richard leaned back with a satisfied exhale, as if the entire vessel now operated under his timetable. Linda asked whether the lender would stop sending threats by morning. And Colton asked whether he could use the master suite for a week or two until things stabilized, each of them speaking in a tone that assumed ownership of the outcome. I gathered my phone from the coaster, and as the screen briefly reflected the 3 signatures aligned beneath the guarantee clause, the last piece of the trap settled exactly where they had helped me place it. They arrived in Phoenix the next afternoon, carrying the same certainty they'd worn on my deck. And when we stepped into Elaine's conference room, Richard remarked that it was impressive how far I'd go to clean up a mess that never should have been mine, while Linda asked whether the lender would stop harassing Colton once the wire cleared. Colton hovered behind them with the restless twitch of someone who believed salvation was already printed on the pages in my tote. And when he muttered that he hadn't slept because he kept imagining headlights behind him, the tension of their gamble sat thick in the quiet that followed. I placed the packet on the polished table and told them we were here for final confirmation before release because the bank required proper documentation for transfers attached to distressed assets. And the expectation in their faces made the next step effortless. Elaine joined us with the wire receipt in her hand and positioned it beside the debt note she'd pulled from her files. And Richard frowned at the unfamiliar header while asking why the lender's name wasn't on the document he expected. So I told him the simplest truth in the calmest way I could manage, that I hadn't paid Colton's debt because I'd purchased it outright. Linda let out a short laugh as if she'd misheard me, but her smile faltered when I slid the debt note forward. and the embossed seal caught the light exactly the way she had admired my bourbon bottles 2 nights earlier. Richard leaned in to read the assignment date, and when he whispered that this couldn't be real because he'd watched me agree to save the family, the denial in his voice brushed against the signatures they had placed so confidently across the guarantee. I opened the packet to the secured guarantee and turned it toward them, pointing to their names stacked in the guarantor section as I explained that ownership of the debt meant ownership of the remedies, and default had already triggered the moment they acknowledged insolvency on record. Colton's breath hitched as he recognized his own words played back against him, and Linda gripped the table while insisting that no one had warned her about consequences hidden in the fine print she didn't bother to read. Richard rose halfway from his chair, sputtering that this was an ambush and that no daughter would weaponize paperwork against her own family. But the guarantee lay open between us, carrying exactly the authority they had signed into existence. I told them the foreclosure timeline was already set under Arizona law and that the transfer of the property lien would proceed without my involvement now that the note belonged to my company, and the silence that followed landed heavier than any accusation they'd thrown at me on my deck. Linda asked whether there was still time to renegotiate, but the question collapsed under the reality printed on the page, and Colton sank back as if the weight of his own signature had finally reached him. I gathered the documents into my bag with the same steady motion I used to secure equipment before a storm, and when I stepped toward the door, the space behind me felt stripped of every assumption they'd carried into the room. 3 weeks later, the judgment moved through the system exactly the way Elaine predicted. And when the notice confirming the completed foreclosure landed in my inbox, the final thread binding me to their expectations loosened with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. Colton's wage garnishment order arrived the same morning, its terms repeating his own recorded admission that he had no means to repay, and the precision of that language echoed the moment he signed without looking at the page. I closed both documents and let the quiet settle, the kind that follows when noise has nowhere left to cling. Back in San Diego, the crew prepared the vessel for a long run, and Samuel lingered near the railing as I walked aboard, asking whether everything in Phoenix had resolved the way it needed to, because he hadn't been able to shake the memory of Richard crowding my space with expectations shaped like orders. I told him the situation had reached its conclusion and that no one would show up demanding access again. And the way his shoulders eased reminded me of how deeply their intrusion had pressed into the people around me. When he offered to check the aft locks twice just to be safe, the gesture carried a sincerity that made the deck feel steadier beneath my feet. The evening drifted in with the tide, and I stood near the bow watching the harbor lights stretch across the water while the engine checks hummed below, the rhythm grounding me in a way Phoenix never could. Samuel stopped beside me long enough to mention that the forecast showed clear weather all week, then added that I looked different tonight, almost like I'd stepped out from under something that had gone on too long. I let the quiet answer for me because the horizon didn't need explanation. And when the lines finally lifted and the vessel slipped free from the dock, the distance I'd been trying to build found its shape without a single word. Thank you for staying with me through every turn of this story. And if any part of my journey mirrors your own search for steadier ground, I hope you carry that strength forward. If you'd like to hear more stories that find their way toward clarity and peace, I'd love to have you here. Subscribe and stay close so we can keep building that calm together.